The first power-up in the most iconic video game literally makes you bigger, but that's not entirely what I mean when I talk about showing a player's growth. The expectation of an average game's difficulty curve is that as the player becomes more familiar with the game, it gets more difficult to compensate. But I think that's worth re-examining. In theory, if skill and difficulty rise synchronously, then the player will never feel any change at all, since the ratio will remain equivalent. That means no desperate struggles, cathartic power trips, or even a sense of scale between challenges, just a samey playthrough. Therefore, if we wanted the player to feel themselves getting better, we'd have to throw in a sequence on par to something they just went through. It makes sense, the secret to showing a change is to repeat the same scenario with a different result, but how can a game do that without coming across as repetitive? How can games balance a level to be fun for differently experienced players? And what's the ideal progression of skill to difficulty ratio? It's relevant to point out that calling a game repetitive really just means that the main loop is boring. Sure, there are games that make you do the same kind of task over and over, but you wouldn't call a game with a strong single-core gameplay loop monotonous, even if it literally is. Take DMC3 for example, where the best boss fight is repeated 3 times throughout the course of a playthrough. Sure, Virgil subtly changes his equipment and patterns between fights, but it's not radical because the encounters are different, it's radical because they're so similar. You get to grow alongside your final boss. For another example, take any game that reuses early game bosses as late game generic enemies. In Dark Souls, the player goes from needing to cheese and outsmart this single invading Tauros demon to overwhelming an entire blitz of them at the source. Sure, the player's already proven that they can beat these guys by the time they show up again, but stopping something that you were once challenged by is incredibly satisfying. My personal favorite is the Hell Vanguard, also from DMC3. The first boss eventually shows up in duplicate alongside non-trivial mobs, and while first-time players have surely gotten better at the game by the point Secret Mission 8 comes around, these monsters continue to force them to concentrate. They don't stop being a spectacle, they just also appear during regular gameplay. Once players start to memorize their patterns based on audio cues, they can't help but feel like they've risen to the occasion. They got good. They grew, and the game acknowledged their experience. The cool thing is that games can have sequences that play differently depending on how far along the player has come. Take for example Tiger Joe from God Hand. He's the most difficult mob in the game, outpacing even a good number of bosses, but most players are able to overwhelm him with the titular technique's invulnerability. However, this feels like cheating since you don't actually have to watch for his patterns, so in his final confrontation Joe makes a point of teasing players who had to rely on their super move. This one little change in dialogue invents an entirely new challenge where more experienced players can prove their worth without stopping noobs at a difficulty curve. For an even more dynamic example, I think of situations like the first Armored Boar sequence back in Dark Souls. You can play the game the regular way, but if you manage to improve, then you'll notice that you can cut some corners. The way this encounter is supposed to go is to force the player into a fight with this powerful baddie and some snipers when this lesser foe drops the gate. The player can systematically off the ranged dudes and then figure out how to cheese the boar, but the best case scenario is to rush through and make it through the gate before it closes Indiana Jones style. The end result is a slow, cautious first run for new players, and an exciting rush for pros. It's the same situation, but it's totally different if you know the game. The only part I dislike about it is that it doesn't reset, so you only get one run per playthrough. It would have been nice to go through that zone over and over again through the course of the game, just to show how the player's confidence grows throughout the playthrough, like they do with some other areas. If a game wants to have interesting moments of struggle and catharsis, then it needs to have a difficulty curve that waxes and wanes. I'll skip the traditional YouTube game design spiel about introducing threats in isolation and then building on them. If you found this channel, you've already heard it, but I do want to touch on how introducing something new later in the game affects the curve. From a narrative perspective, it's really satisfying to have the player gain an 11th hour superpower where they get a buff right at the end for a cathartic win. But while these moments are awesome, we can all agree, they do suffer from being either a victory lap separated from the rest of the game, or a necessary upgrade that the player only gets in New Game Plus. Take Nero's Devil Trigger from DMCV. He only gets it once it's time for his final fight, since that's the most cathartic place to get the upgrade, but then players don't get to use it for the majority of their first playthrough. Not only that, but it brings into question whether or not using it at all is a tool like any other move, or an overpowered reward for beating the game all the way through. Is it the win button, or just heavy punch? Because of this, balancing upgrades and difficulty is awkward in general. Take the wonderful 1-on-1's shop system. The idea is to strip the player of their huge move pool so that the player can learn it one maneuver at a time, but it's kinda an imperfect solution. Firstly, it makes experienced players wait to unlock a moveset they already know. The game doesn't feel complete until you have all your tech, so the player feels artificially limited. Next, new players might not know what to buy and end up running into a fight without something important, not only making their own life harder than it needs to be, but also forcing the game to be beatable without any of the secret moves. The difficulty can't keep pace with the player's experience because it would screw over players who just decide to skip the shop. The only way to juggle a healthy curve with vertical upgrades about is to take them away as dynamically as you give them out. Take the laser from Star Fox 64. Yes, its upgraded form is objectively better than the default, but since it goes away the second you lose a life, it manages to define the game instead of just simplifying it. Easier bits become less tedious since you can overwhelm them with perfect play, and harder bits become more intense since you want to hold on to your power-ups. Plus, the difficulty curve never has to dip to introduce a new mechanic. While yes, the game is easier when the player gets stronger, holding onto it long enough to really make a difference requires more skilled play. That balances out. A game can capitalize on a player's growth with clever reuse of assets. A quote-unquote repetitive game is really just a boring one, and a good core loop can keep things fresh on its own. The player doesn't need artificial damage boosts or unlockable tools to make the player feel like they're getting better when it can just teach them how to play, and yes, while a vertical upgrade is satisfying, it limits early game players to a less fun campaign if it can't be lost. As much as devs tried to mechanize the human ability to get good through things like upgrades and level ups, the real growth was inside us all along. We should probably get that checked out.